Hello chess friends, this is International Master Valeri Lilov for the Remote Chess Academy, and today I would like to give you my take on the most interesting moments and highlights from the World Chess Championship in Sochi that was played between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. I'd like to show you the most important, most critical moments, the instructive moments, what you can learn and get from that match, and really what was the reason for which Anand lost, Carlsen won, and what you can actually use from that match so that you can incorporate in your games and get on your path to become a master. So the most critical game that was played between Carlsen and Anand in the second round, where actually Carlsen won. The game started in a pretty straightforward way. It was a nice development, the Spanish with d3, and I believe in a way Anand with black's pieces thought that this would be very equal, and so he can develop naturally and just get a good game. He did knight d7 and even bishop b6. The truth is that those two backward moves really affected this position badly. One of the things that I want to tell you is that backward moves really reduce the possibilities. Whatever chances you have to get a good opening and a good middle game, that really goes away the moment you set your pieces backward. So I do recommend you, whenever it's possible, just stay away from backward moves. They don't work too well. The fact is that black should have played in this position instead of knight f6, possibly bishop e6 or h6 and bishop e6, and most likely he'd get a very normal development and the position would stay equal. Instead, he made a couple of backward moves, and although they were having some good ideas, the truth is that there were too many backward drawbacks, to the black position. So essentially after a5, there was knight x to the b6, and everybody who looks at this position would probably say that it looks pretty symmetrical and pretty equal, and the truth is that it isn't, and it isn't because of white's move of d4. You see, the most important area in chess is what we call the center area. Those four squares out there determine a lot who's going to have more control in the game and the flexibility to do his plans faster, stronger, and more organized. The fact is that now white's got two pawns versus one of black in the middle, and that tension that white is keeping out there is the one thing that guarantees him not only more space but good activity that goes directly against the black king. In fact, the move of d4 was so good that if black takes the pawn, white's ready to recapture. So we realize that this pressure coming against black's middle is the one thing that guarantees white a huge success, starting up with rook e8. The most important thing is to consider that the center and the piece activity, most importantly their prospects, they guarantee everything. At one point white exchanged and it looks like the center is equal, but the problem is that the pieces are not equal. White has tremendous possibilities in attacking value on the king side, and with his backward or undeveloped pieces, black had a really hard time in being able to stop white's possibility to move up and advance his attack much further. Shortly after, when black made a couple of exchanges, he did probably one of the most important things that people shouldn't do when they're in bad positions. Don't change easily the position, because you see, your opponent may have a pressure and may feel like you stay in a position that's just not so good, and yet if your opponent doesn't have any serious threats that he can make against you, you don't want to change the position too easily. A change of the position could direct to some new weaknesses or some new possibilities, and I think black should have waited. Exchanging the f5 simply led to some pretty solid exchanges by white, and even more pressure, which doesn't actually go nearly on the king side, but it also goes towards the center and some of the black weak squares and pawns on the other side. A couple of mistakes happened. Black obviously created a quite weak pawn on the f4, and that gave white a brilliant possibility to further go against it and dominate with his pieces. The most important learning points from this game and what you can learn is that it is incredibly important to control the center, consider the prospects of the piece, not just how they stand but where they can go, so that the opening and the pawn structure you build could really affect and help you to have a better development and a good order. So this game was very effectively won by Carlsen, and then we have the second, well actually it was the third game of the match, but the second game that finished with the result win. This was a game in which Carlsen was playing with the black pieces and Anand was the one who was going to actually show his potential. The game started pretty nicely. In fact, white developed pretty well, and then he did the move of c5. You see, similar to the previous game, this game was mainly influenced by the pawn structure. The pawn structure really relates to the piece activity and the possibilities they'll have, and a lot to the planning. That's why whenever we study openings, one of the things that I'll recommend from my own experience is that we focus on the pawn structure, the prospects of the pawn structure, and the different ideas that it can provide within the prospects, like pressure, attacks, activity, whatever. So the truth is, white got a really good activity with c5 and b4 and a3. So black was always behind in his development, and he had a problem. He even started playing on the queen side, hoping that white isn't developed. But the pawn structure, that's everything. The powerful b5 breakthrough helped white to take over the initiative and show that with that c5 pawn, essentially he gets a strong passed pawn. I know what you're gonna say, Valerie, that passed pawn can't do a thing. It's blocked right now and it can be easily targeted by black. The truth is that it doesn't matter. The passed pawn is always strong because it holds one or two of the opponent's pieces to protect it, and therefore it quite seriously limits his activity. Now black's queen was back, and the majority of his pieces also couldn't get involved into play. So he tried a couple things like b4 and a4, and yet it didn't work out at all. White just developed well. He had that pawn on the c7, a couple of the other pieces beautifully placed, and he even found this incredible knight g5. Yes, how can you find a move like knight g5? And what's knight g5 about? Well, knight g5 was one of the most powerful moves for white to keep his pressure. You see, every significant attack is based on one thing and one thing only, and that's the ability to create threats. If you ever want to create threats, there are a variety of different ways to do it, but certainly the most important way to deliver threats against the opponent is to have advanced pieces and good targets to go against. Right now, we've got a strong and very powerful asset, the passed pawn. The black queen is behind, and we certainly want to do knight d6 and possibly promote it. So, in order to create threats, sometimes you will need to prepare and set up more strong pieces, or sometimes, like in this position, you just need to eliminate or destroy the opponent's defenders. So, you know, when you're attacking, pause for a second. Don't just go on with the attack. Like, think about it. What is the main defender that my opponent has? Like, the piece without which his position or his defense would simply collapse. That's what we call the main defender. And that's how we can distinguish it amongst all these other pieces that he's got. Right now, without the bishop, without that knight, it would be really difficult for black to hold the d6 square. So knight g5 was a good shot. In fact, that knight can be taken, but then we realize that after bishop takes g5, black can't really take on g5 due to the d6, and he'd lose a rook when that pawn promotes. And if he doesn't do it, well, I suppose white's bishop will be quite devastating once it steps onto the e7 or even goes to d8. So it was really powerful method on how white could keep his initiative in place. Later on, it was lovely to see all these complications happening, and they really resulted in white's favor because that c7 pawn was a killer. It held back all black's pieces, and by the time he was ready to do something with the a pawn or with the rook, he actually discovered that there is no chance on how that queen and that rook, some of the most important pieces that black has, could ever get into play. So the game was basically lost. That c7 pawn was a destructive piece, and therefore Anand actually managed to win. So that's not so to speak about the game itself. I think the opening was the reason for Carlsen to lose this game. And one instructive and very interesting point is that c5 doesn't always work. In fact, if you want to make c5 to work, you must be sure about two things. First, there's got to be the defense of the rook on a1, because if you just do c5, if your bishop is on c1, for example, and you haven't got the rook defended, you can play b6, b4, a5, and then if you try a3, similar to what Carlsen and Anand did in this case against Carlsen's move, if your rook is unprotected, black will just take a takes b4, and he can't take back because the rook would hang. Imagine if the bishop is on c1. So you see, this is the first need. And then the second, which is even more important, you need to have e5 under your control. If that square isn't under white's control, black is going to play e5, undermine c5, and start advancing in a very dangerous way. So white made sure that e5 is under his command, and so he could advance and gain space, provoking black to violate one of the most important rules that comes in these positions. Don't ever play on the side of the board where your opponent is going. In fact, white was the one who was advancing on queen's side, and black just thought that white doesn't have enough preparation. Yet, it turns out that the pawn structure and the restriction of black's pieces is more significant and unfavorable than the white less developed. He can get his pieces very quickly out after bishop takes d6 and b5, and yet black was never in condition to quite handle the power of the c7 pawn and the white's coming pieces that create pretty superior attacks in a short amount of time. After the third game, the result was 1.5 versus 1.5. After the draw on the quick draw on game 1, the defeat that Anand experienced in game 2, and the comeback on game 3, game 4 and 5 happened to be a little boring, although there was fight in them. They actually ended up with draws, and the critical game for the match was the game number 6. Oh yes. In this game, already the two players were in very good psychological shape, and they knew what they are expected to play and how they're expected to play. Carlsen, known for his superior technical skill and ability to outplay his opponents in positional and quiet positions, I believe was searching for more closed and more quiet type of game. Anand, who was obviously very successful in game number 3, knew that all he needs to do is a position that's more open, more tactical, and essentially more sharp. So this game number 6, Carlsen had the white pieces, and he started off with e4, knight f3, and d4, which led to c6 to the d, knight x to the d, and the can variation. The Sicilian can is known as a very sharp and quite a practical opening. Every player who knows how to deal with dynamic positions, these kind of tactical situations, can actually handle can in a very strong way against white. So Anand was definitely more than capable and prepared to do it. So Carlsen decided to optimize his structure by setting up the Maroczy setup. c4 is eventually going to be the starting point to knight c3, and these e4 and c4 are going to make it more difficult for black to play with d5 and b5 later on. So essentially it's a good pressuring system so that he can reduce black's possibilities for counterplay. Naturally, there is one drawback, and the drawback is that c4 loses a tempo, and it lets black to pin the knight as well as challenge the e4 pawn. White played queen d3 and knight c6 with an idea to challenge the center. Now, to be honest, there is probably queen to c7, which I think, psychologically and practically it would have been better for Anand, because knight c6 allowed white to exchange on c6, and given that black doesn't want to actually take with the pawn, I mean, if he takes with the pawn on the c6, there is a3, and then we realize the real problem in here. I mean, after a3, bishop takes to the c and queen takes to the c3, this whole pin doesn't mean anything. I mean, e4 can fall. It's g7 that's attacked. Bishop g5 will come next. White will protect it, and I think that this whole formation is really good for white. He's got more space, and a move like d5 later on will be quite difficult, because even if black develops and prepares, white will obviously do the same. A move like d5 will lead to a lot of pawns exchanging, and the bishop pair is something tremendous that white will certainly utilize. So essentially, black was forced to take with the d pawn, and that leads to the queen exchange and an endgame, which was very disadvantageous to Anand. Anand was looking for a sharp and tactical game where he's strong, and now we got an endgame somewhere. Carlsen is simply superior than anyone in the world right now, and so this was just a bad choice to play knight c6. It wasn't a bad move, it was a bad choice. So essentially, the game continued, and Carlsen outplay his opponent gradually. See, this is why I say that in chess there is a lot of psychology, you see, and I'm not just talking about psychology in terms of how you play. It's about how you plan your game, what your opponent is, what he likes to do, what he doesn't. This is very important. The time when Bobby Fischer used to say, I don't care about psychology but just the good moves, it's now past. In the modern era, everybody has really grown in his chess understanding a lot, and let's face it, not everyone has Fischer's technique and talent to play chess on 200% of their mental capacity. Everybody is more talented, more prepared, but yes, we're all strong. We all have strong sides and weak sides and a great potential. So psychology is very important, and this is something that has to be considered as most important in this match, because the psychology was essential for many of the wins and the losses that happened during that match. So essentially, the exchange took place. In some way, the exchange looks like actually it affects White's position bad, because he's got a bad bishop on f4 and double pawns and an isolated pawn on a2. So really, with a passive bishop and the pawn weaknesses, it seems more like White will suffer a lot in that endgame. We know that endgames are pretty slow and quiet, and if White doesn't get any compensation, then these pawn weaknesses will cost him the game later on. And yet there is one factor that proves very important for White here. Even though it's an endgame, there are lots of pieces remaining on the board. And when there are more than 4 pieces remaining on the board, the one thing that's actually quite valuable in the middle game still stands for the endgame. And that's the value of the piece activity and the ability to take initiative, to create pressure against the opponent. When there are more pieces on the board, if you get better developed, if you have a chance to create threats and make pressure, even though it is generally considered an endgame, as the queens are exchanged, with more than 3, like 4 or 5 pieces available on the board, now 4, 2 rooks and 2 bishops, we don't count the kings, I believe White relied on the speed and the possibility to create pressure before Black can consolidate and blocks to attack those pawns. After bishop b7, White played rook d3, which was a beautiful way to get the rook ready for g3. And as that rook went to g3, we realized that Black actually doesn't have a good way to hold his pawns. I mean, if he plays rook h to g8, there is the simple bishop d3 with the threat of bishop h7 and then rook takes g7. So he had to do rook a to g8, and now you're starting to understand that there will never be time for Black to really attack on the c4 or do anything similar. White's ability were much superior on the king side due to his f4, f5 cores and the possibility to get the rook in play too. Black tried g6, and then after h takes g, knight takes g6 and rook h5, the pressure was held, and most of Black's pieces were really on the backside defending and being quite limited. It was good to see how White really waited, and that's something interesting. You don't want to hurry. When you hold the pressure like that, keep it slow. And that's probably the reason why Carlsen got too comfortable with his position and he made the significant blunder. That was probably one of the very few blunders that actually happened on that level, because this move was really a blunder. That was the moment where Anand could have taken the chance to win the game and actually be ahead in with one point, just 6 games, like through the first half of the match. After that move, king d2 was bad because it allows a motive to stand, and that's why I always tell my students, you know what, you would always like to think about motives in an open position. Now, what is a motive? Motive is a potential danger. Like, essentially, when there is a weakness or when there is something that's hanging, like there are lots of motives, like an exposed, unprotected piece, like an X-ray. What we see right now is called an X-ray. You know, one piece eventually attacking against the other, and there is something in between, but that's still an X-ray, because if that piece in between can move with a tempo or take on something, it's very dangerous. So essentially, Black had this rook against the g4, he had that knight, and now there is one more motive, this exposed king. See, you never want to sit on a motive. I believe all White had to do was just to move his rook on the g3, then move his king slowly so that it's not very exposed, and gradually bring it to e2, which would have helped him to sustain his advantage with no risks at all. Instead, the motive on g4 remains, as well as the king on d2, which actually Black could exploit with knight x d5 now. After rook takes g8, we see that obviously White can't take the knight due to the rook on g4. He has to take on g8, and then Black has the in-between knight takes to the c4. King e2, and rook takes g8. If the king goes to d3, there is this one additional in-between check, and then Black is just a pawn up, and there is nothing that you know, White can do here. There's rook takes g2, and everything is more or less bad for White. So I have to say, motives are essential, and sometimes even grandmasters forget about them. I believe that Carlsen was just too comfortable with his position, so he didn't see it. And a couple moves after, when the king went to e2, and then it was f3, obviously Anand said that he was just too focused on the queen side, which is some other mistake, and as you can see, everybody can make that kind of mistake. It's not about the beginner, not about intermediate players or strong players. Even top grandmasters can make it. It's called tunnel vision. Tunnel vision means that you focus on one area alone and you forget, or you actually don't focus too much on the other sides. This is something that everybody does, more or less. To avoid it, I recommend that before every move, we just pause for a second with our calculations and we look through the whole board to check if there is something that we missed. If you do that on every move, if you make it a habit, there will be less chance to miss important tactics and possibilities like knight x d5. So the moment Anand missed the knight x d5, the match was practically over. The game was lost because he also made that weakness on a3, which simply forced the black rook to stay undefended, while the weaknesses on the king side are still present, and in a couple of moves time, he lost the pawn and the game as well. After that game, there were a couple draws, actually 4 draws that happened in a sequence, but it was obvious that Anand simply lost his steam. He realized the blunder and the actual mistake that he made of missing the chance to win the game, and so essentially it was all over. The final 11th game of the match, Anand made an incorrect exchange sacrifice, but it looked like his steam was just, it was out of steam. He wasn't really looking so much to win the game anymore, and obviously the motivation wasn't there. He lost the chance to win a game, and probably his chance to win the match on game number 6. In any case, it was an interesting match to see some very important and instructive mistakes that we could also learn from, and I hope that you have enjoyed these games, these fighting games, much more than they were last year, and there were lots of lessons. So I look forward to seeing the World Championship 2005, and my prediction, Carlsen versus Caruana. Well, that will be really cool. So thank you again for watching, and if you have any questions or any comments or anything interesting to suggest, please comment and subscribe for the RCA channel on YouTube.